The smoke hadn't cleared from her lungs yet. Not really, not even 4 years after Kandahar. And still Jess Morrow ran straight back into it. Not the kind of smoke that billows black and acrid over a burning convoy. The quiet kind, the kind that settles into hospital corridors at 2 a.m. when the overhead lights flicker and the ventilators hiss and the monitors chirp their indifferent little songs. The kind that gets into your chest and stays there. Jessamine Morrow, Jess to everyone who'd ever trusted her with a needle, was 31 years old, a former Army combat medic who had spent 2 deployments keeping men alive in conditions that had no business allowing anyone to survive. She had packed wounds with her bare hands in the dark. She had called time of death on boys younger than her little brother. She had come home to Billings, Montana with a combat medical badge, a partially torn rotator cuff that never quite healed right, and a deep cellular level understanding that the human body is both more fragile and more stubborn than anyone gives it credit for. She had parlayed her military training into a nursing degree at Montana State, and then, chasing better pay and something she couldn't quite name, moved west to Cascade Valley Medical Center, a mid-sized regional hospital perched at the edge of Spokane, Washington, where the pine trees crowded right up to the parking lot and the Cascade foothills turned purple at dusk. She had worked the emergency department for 2 years. She was good at it the way she had been good at combat medicine. Not with flair, not with speeches, but with a steady pair of hands and the ability to make rapid, correct decisions without the luxury of certainty. She was not supposed to be working the overnight shift on the 3rd Friday of March. She had traded with a colleague named Patterson, who had a daughter's birthday party and a husband's work trip colliding on the same weekend. Jess didn't mind nights. Nights were honest. The patients who came through the door after midnight weren't there because it was convenient. The shift had started with a 4-car pileup on Highway 2, which emptied itself of drama by 10:30. After that, a thick, unusual stillness settled over the department. The paramedics who came in around 11 for a coffee refill said it was quiet on the roads too. Cold front moving in from the northwest. People staying home. At 11:48 p.m., the radio above the nurse's station crackled. Cask Valley, incoming. Male, approximately 45, found unresponsive at residence. Significant head trauma, suspected fall, possible intracranial bleed. ETA 4 minutes. Jess was already pulling gloves on by the time the paramedics pushed through the sliding bay doors. The man on the stretcher was big, 6'2" at least, broad across the shoulders in the way that spoke less of a gym and more of a life spent carrying heavy things. His head was bandaged hastily, the gauze already soaked through on the left side. His vitals were all wrong. Blood pressure tanking, pulse thready and fast. But what Jess noticed, before she noticed any of that, was the dog. The dog had come in with him. It wasn't supposed to. The paramedics had tried, she'd learn this later, to leave the animal outside. But the dog had refused, not aggressively, not with biting or lunging. Simply refused the way only a certain kind of dog can refuse, with a fixed, utterly certain stillness that communicates a single message. I am not leaving this man. One of the paramedics, a soft-hearted woman named Chow, had eventually given up and let the dog jump into the rig. It was a German shepherd, older than Titan, gray at the muzzle, with a scarred left ear that had been partially torn at some point and healed unevenly. He wore a vest, faded olive green, the patches worn but legible. Surface animal, do not pet. Veteran's assistant's dog. His name, embroidered on the collar, was Ghost. Ghost trotted beside the gurney with the calm focus of an animal who had been in chaotic environments before and found them unremarkable. His amber eyes tracked the man on the stretcher and nothing else. "He's a registered service animal," Chow said quickly, anticipating the objection. "The neighbor said the vet." "The veteran, he lives no one else." Dr. Leon Ferris, the attending on duty, didn't have time for the dog. He was already calling for a CT, ordering blood, pushing fluid. "Get the animal out of my trauma bay," he said without looking up. Jess looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at Jess. The dog's expression was not one of distress. It was one of absolute, patient attention, the expression of an animal who has learned that the best way to be useful is to be still and wait. "I'll take him," Jess said. Ferris glanced at her over his glasses. "You're on shift, Morrow." "My next intake's not for another hour minimum. I'll keep him in the ambulance dock. He won't interfere." She kept her voice level. She knew how to make a statement sound like a request without actually being one, a skill she'd learned in uniform. "He'll tear the place apart if he can't see what's happening to his handler. Then he'll be a problem." That was a slight exaggeration. Ghost didn't look like the tearing apart type, but Ferris didn't know that. "Fine. 20 minutes. Jess clicked her tongue. Ghost's ear swiveled toward her. She walked toward the bay doors, and after one last look at the unconscious man, the dog followed her. She took him to the ambulance dock, a covered, partially enclosed space with a concrete floor and a rolling metal door that could seal the bay from the weather. It was cold, but sheltered. She found a folded emergency blanket on a supply shelf and laid it out on the floor. Ghost ignored it and stood at the edge of the dock, looking out at the parking lot with the watchful alertness of an animal on guard. Jess sat on an overturned equipment crate. She watched the dog for a moment. "You've done this before," she said quietly, the waiting. Ghost glanced back at her over his shoulder, then returned to his vigil. She knew the type. She had known handlers in Kandahar who described their dogs in terms that sounded, if you weren't paying attention, like they were describing partners, not pets, not tools. Partners. The dogs knew things their handlers knew, when to push and when to hold still, when the situation was contained and when it wasn't. She got up and stood beside Ghost, looking out at the parking lot. The sodium lights turned the wet asphalt an ugly amber. The air smelled like pine and coming rain. She did not see the man in the far corner of the lot. He was parked in a rusted pickup, 3 spaces from the tree line, lights off, engine running. He had been sitting there for 40 minutes. His name was Cody Breck. Cody Breck was 43 years old and had never in his life been described as a careful man. He had a record in 3 states: assault, breaking and entering, possession with intent. The latest charge 6 months ago in Yakima had been dropped on a technicality. He walked. He always walked. Something about that particular luck had convinced him, over the years, that the world was organized around his convenience. The man on the stretcher inside Cascade Valley Medical Center was Marcus Webb. Former Army Ranger, retired after a knee injury had ended his career at 38. Marcus had been living in the same house on the eastern edge of Spokane for 4 years. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He grew tomatoes in the summer and shoveled his neighbors' walks in the winter without being asked. His only companion was Ghost, who had been assigned to him by a veterans assistance organization 3 years ago and had not left his side since. 6 days ago, Marcus had witnessed Cody Breck stealing a car in the parking lot of a hardware store on Sprague Avenue. Marcus had taken out his phone and called 911. He had waited, calmly, until the police arrived. He had given a statement. He had not backed down when Cody, handcuffed in the back of the patrol car, had stared at him through the window with the particular flat expression of a man cataloging a debt. Cody had been released on bail 2 days later. He had spent the remaining days confirming what he'd already suspected. The man who had called the police on him lived alone except for a dog. What happened next? The fall Marcus had taken that evening. A shove, in truth, from behind, on his back porch, caught on a neighbor's doorbell camera that the police wouldn't review for another 6 hours, had not been an accident. Cody had watched the ambulance leave. He had followed it at a distance, headlights off the last half mile. He had parked in the lot and he had waited because he was not done. The dog was still outside. Jess had been on the dock for 11 minutes when Ghost went rigid. It was not a dramatic transformation. He didn't bark or lunge. It was more like a frequency change. The difference between a tuning fork resting on a table and a tuning fork that has just been struck. Every muscle in his body sharpened to a different attention. His nostrils flared twice. His gaze locked on a point at the far end of the ambulance dock, where the concrete apron met the parking lot. Jess followed his line of sight. She saw the figure moving along the tree line at a low, quick walk, hoodie up, hands in the front pocket, moving toward the dock from the blind side. Her body understood before her mind fully articulated it. Something specific happened in her chest. Not fear, exactly. A kind of focused, cold clarity that she recognized from deployment. The amygdala stepping back, the training stepping forward. She reached for the radio clipped to her hip. Dead. She'd left it on the charger inside to get the dock door open. Her phone was in her left scrub's pocket. She didn't reach for it yet. "Hey," she called. Her voice came out flat and steady. "This is a restricted area. The emergency entrance is on the other side of the building." The figure didn't stop. "Sir, stop walking, please." He stopped, but it was the stop of a man choosing when to move again, not the stop of someone who had been redirected. He was 15 feet away. In the amber spill of the dock lights, she could see his face under the hood, angular, unshaven, eyes moving fast. "Is that the dog?" Breck said. His voice was conversational in a way that made her stomach tighten. "The old vet's dog? You need to leave this area," Jess said. "I just want to see the dog." He took a step forward. Ghost made a sound she had never heard an animal make before. Not quite a growl, more like a sustained subsonic vibration, the auditory equivalent of a hand on a gun. He stepped in front of her. Not toward Breck. In front of her. Jess's hand found her phone. Breck lunged. He came in fast and low, and what he had in his right hand caught the dock light. A folding knife, blade already open, the kind sold at gas stations and bait shops, and carried by men who tell themselves they only use it for fishing. He wasn't going for her. He was going for Ghost. She knew it the same way she had known, on a dust-covered road outside of Kandahar, that the pressure plate was 15 inches left of where the convoy was tracking. A knowledge assembled from 100 small signals faster than conscious thought. Ghost was the leverage. Ghost was the point. She had exactly 1 second. Jess Morrow had packed wounds in the dark. She had dragged a 200-pound man out of a burning Humvee with a dislocated left shoulder. She had, on one particular night in 2019 that she did not talk about, kept a 19-year-old alive through a sucking chest wound for 47 minutes with nothing but a plastic wrapper and her hands. Until the medevac arrived. She threw herself left, into the path of the knife, shoulder first, taking Breck's forearm across her collarbone as she simultaneously drove her right elbow hard into his face. The blade caught her across the upper left arm as the impact redirected it. A clean horizontal cut, deep but not arterial. She registered it the way you register a burn on a stove. Wrong place, wrong time, deal with it later. Breck staggered. She hadn't hit him hard enough, the angle was off, and he was bigger than he'd looked at distance. He recovered in 2 seconds, which was 1 second longer than Ghost had been waiting. The shepherd hit him from the right side at full speed, 70-odd pounds of animal, and 4 years of trained response. Jaws closing on Breck's forearm, with a precision that spoke of a dog who had practiced this. Breck screamed, a high, stunned sound. The scream of someone who has never actually been hurt before and is discovering, too late, what that feels like. He went down, Ghost held. Jess was already on her phone. Security, ambulance doc now. I have an intruder, bring 2 people. He's going to need restraint, and I need someone to look at my arm. Her voice was completely level. It was the voice she had used calling in medevac coordinates. Same voice. Different situation. Same thing. Breck was on the concrete, Ghost standing over him, applying exactly enough pressure to communicate that movement was inadvisable. He was not thrashing. He was very, very still. Good boy, Jess said to Ghost. Ghost's tail moved once. He did not take his eyes off Breck. The next 12 minutes were efficient and loud. 2 security officers and a charge nurse came through the dock door at a run. Jess handed off Breck, now crying, his forearm already swelling to something remarkable, to the security team and let the charge nurse examine her arm under the dock lights. The cut was long and would need suturing, and she had lost enough blood to make the concrete look alarming, but the nurse confirmed what Jess had already assessed. Nothing severed, no arterial involvement. She was going to be fine. You need to get inside, the nurse said. In a minute. Jess looked at Ghost. The dog was watching the security officers escort Breck back toward the building, tracking them with his eyes until they disappeared through the door. Then he turned, walked back to Jess, and sat directly at her feet. He looked up at her. His expression, if a dog could be said to have an expression, was one of settled, quiet acknowledgement. The kind of look exchanged between 2 people who have just been through something together and don't need to discuss it. Jess crouched down. Slowly, because the arm was beginning to register properly now, the adrenaline thinning, and looked at him. Yeah, she said. I know. Inside, the story assembled itself quickly from the pieces available. The neighbor's doorbell footage. Breck's record, the bail paperwork, the detective who arrived within the hour, a compact, precise woman named Elise Tanner, moved through the pieces with a quiet efficiency that Jess found professionally admirable. Marcus Webb came out of surgery at 4:17 a.m. The intracranial pressure had been manageable, no bleed, a severe concussion, and a cracked orbital bone from the fall. He would wake up with a headache that would last for weeks and a scar above his left eye, but he would wake up. Dr. Farris, grim-faced and efficient, relayed this to Jess as an orderly was finishing the last of her sutures in a curtained bay 2 doors down. 12 stitches, the orderly said. You're going to want to keep that arm still for a few days. Sure, Jess said. She would not keep her arm still. She had done this before. Ghost was permitted. After a brief argument between 2 nurses, the charge nurse and a doctor who had opinions about animals in clinical spaces, to be brought inside and settled in the hallway outside Marcus's room, where he lay with his nose against the door and his eyes open, waiting for morning. Jess checked on him at 5 a.m. on her way back from a supply run. She brought him a cup of water in a kidney dish, which was not technically hospital-approved dog equipment, but it was what she had. Ghost drank it without ceremony and then looked up at her with his gray muzzle and his scarred ear and the particular dignity of an old dog who has learned not to waste attention on things that don't matter. She sat with him for a while. She thought about Kandahar. She thought about the 2 years she'd spent unlearning the particular alertness of deployed life and the way it had never quite gone, not completely. Living just below the surface, in her chest like an ember that hadn't decided whether to go out. She thought it was possible that was not the worst thing in the world, that some things stay lit for a reason. At 9:23 a.m., Marcus Webb opened his eyes. His first word was, "Ghost." The nurse who happened to be checking his monitors at that moment, not Jess, who was finally off shift and sitting in the break room with a terrible cup of coffee, stepped back in surprise as the old German shepherd pushed the room door open, padded across the linoleum, and placed his gray head carefully on the edge of the hospital bed. Marcus's hand moved to the dog's neck. He closed his eyes again. His shoulders, which had been rigid, dropped. The nurse would tell Jess about it later. She said she had been in nursing for 19 years, and she had seen a lot of things, and that moment was in a category mostly by itself. Marcus asked about what had happened when he was more fully awake. At 11 that morning, when Detective Tanner came to take his statement, he listened without interrupting, the way combat-trained people often listen. Not because they're processing slowly, but because they're processing everything at once. At the end, Tanner told him that Breck was in custody, that the bail violation alone would keep him held pending trial, and that the footage from the neighbor's camera had been retrieved and was being reviewed. "The nurse," Marcus said, "who took care of Ghost." Tanner paused. "She's actually the one who stopped Breck. He came at the dog. She intervened." Marcus said nothing for a long moment. Ghost was on the floor beside the bed, his chin on his paws. "Where is she? Off shift, we think." "She'd been on since midnight." Marcus asked for a pen. He wrote something on a square of paper towel from the bedside table, all that was available, and folded it once and handed it to Tanner. "Would you make sure she gets this?" Tanner looked at the folded paper, unasked. "Sure." The note found Jess in the break room, delivered by a nursing assistant, who looked slightly uncertain about the provenance of a note written on a paper towel. Jess unfolded it. It said, "My name is Marcus. I need to thank you in person. When you're ready. No rush. We'll be here." Jess read it twice. She folded it back along the same crease. She put it in her scrubs pocket next to her phone. She finished her coffee. She sat for another minute in the particular silence of a hospital break room at the shift's end. When the fluorescent lights hum and the refrigerator clicks and everyone who has been carrying something heavy is temporarily allowed to set it down. Then she got up, walked down the hall, and knocked on the door of room 412. "Come in," said a voice that was rougher than she expected, the voice of a man who hadn't spoken in a while and was relearning how. She pushed open the door. Ghost lifted his head immediately. His tail thumped once on the linoleum floor. He looked at her with the same settled recognition he had shown in the parking dock. The recognition of an animal who has cataloged you as safe, which is, in the accounting of certain kinds of dogs, the highest possible category. Marcus Webb was propped against the pillows, the left side of his face still swollen, a bandage over his orbital socket. His eyes the careful, taking stock, kind of eyes that belong to men who have spent time in places where reading a room quickly is not a preference, but a requirement. He looked at her arm, which was bandaged from elbow to shoulder. He looked at her face. "You were the one on the dock," he said. "Jess Morrow," she said. "Former Army. I was a combat medic. He nodded slowly as if something had just confirmed itself. Marcus Webb, Ranger Battalion, 2nd and 3rd Deployment, Afghanistan. He paused. You want to sit down? She did. They talked for 40 minutes, which surprised both of them. They talked about the Army, the way veterans talk about it when they're not performing for civilians. Not the acronyms and the bravado, but the texture of it, the specific quality of certain silences, the strange difficulty of fluorescent lights after a long time in the field. They talked about dogs. Marcus told her Ghost had been assigned to him 18 months after he got out, when the VA had finally accepted what Marcus had been reluctant to name, and how Ghost had done more for him in 3 years than any other form of assistance had managed. He won't leave my side, Marcus said, looking at Ghost, who had moved during their conversation to lie with his back against the leg of Jess's chair. Not since day one. People think that's a trained behavior. It's not entirely. Some of it is just him. Jess looked down at the old dog's gray muzzle resting against her shoe. I know, she said. She meant, I saw that on the dock. I saw what he did. I understand what that is. Marcus understood what she meant. He nodded. She left after that to go home and sleep. What she didn't know, walking out of room 412 and down the elevator to the parking lot, where her car sat in the pale, late morning light under the pine trees, was that Marcus had made a phone call of his own. At some point that morning, in the window when Detective Tanner had stepped out and the nurses were on rounds, he had called a man named Doyle Kraft, who was a retired first sergeant and currently ran an informal network. Not official, not on any organizational chart, of veterans in the greater Spokane area who stayed in contact with each other, who checked on each other, who showed up when they were needed. Marcus had said, someone looked after Ghost last night and got hurt doing it. I want her to know we haven't forgotten. Kraft had said, give me until tomorrow morning. Jess drove home. She slept. She woke at 4 in the afternoon to 17 missed calls. A text from the nursing director that said, please call me when you're awake, and a text from a number she didn't recognize that said only, look outside. She looked outside. The street in front of her apartment building was lined with vehicles, trucks mostly, a few SUVs, a pair of motorcycles. They were parked in both directions as far as she could see from her window, orderly, engines off. Standing on the sidewalk and the strip of winter grass in front of the building were men. Dozens of them in civilian clothes, jeans and jackets and work boots, standing with their hands at their sides or clasped in front of them in the particular at-rest posture of people who have spent time in formations. They weren't holding signs. They weren't chanting. They weren't doing anything except standing there, facing the building, in the 31-degree March air of Spokane, Washington, as if standing outside in the cold was the most natural thing a person could do on a Thursday afternoon. Jess stood at her window for a long moment. She recognized with the part of her brain that had never entirely stopped running threat assessment, that not one of them was a threat. The quality of their stillness was not hostile. It was the stillness of a guard of honor. It was the stillness of men who have learned that presence is a form of statement, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up and refuse to leave. Her phone buzzed. The unknown number again. My name is Doyle Kraft. Marcus Webb called me this morning. There are 160 of us out here. We'll stay as long as you need us to. You're one of ours. We don't forget. Jess read the message twice. She put the phone down on the windowsill. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She was not, in general, a person who cried easily. The Army had not made her hard. It had made her efficient, which is a different thing. But there were certain kinds of things that bypassed efficiency entirely, that went around the careful internal architecture and found whatever is underneath. This was one of those things. She stood there for a while. The men on the street stood too. The pine trees at the end of the block moved in the cold wind off the Cascades. In the apartment, everything was very quiet. After a while, she pulled on her coat and went downstairs. She pushed open the front door of the building and stood on the stoop. The cold hit her face immediately. 160 men turned toward her, not in unison, not with any command. Just the natural movement of people who have been waiting and have now seen what they were waiting for. A man in a gray jacket detached from the front of the group and walked toward her. He was in his 60s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of face that has spent decades being weathered by things other than weather. "Doyle Craft," he said, and extended his hand. "First Sergeant, retired. Ranger Battalion, like Marcus." She shook it. Her bandaged arm made her wince slightly. He noticed. He didn't make a thing of it. "Marcus told me what you did," Kraft said. "What you've done before, we know your record." He paused. "We also know you haven't been connected up with anyone since you got out. That ends today if you want it to." Jess looked out at the assembled men on her street. She looked back at Kraft. "I was just doing my job," she said. It was the thing people say. It was also, she knew, genuinely how it had felt. Not heroism, not sacrifice, just the immediate application of training to a situation that required it. But Kraft shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You were doing our job, and we take care of the people who do that." Ghost had been permitted, in the confusion of the morning and through the diplomacy of Detective Tanner, to be transported with Marcus to a private room that had a slightly larger footprint and a window. Marcus had been allowed to bring him. The hospital had, after some negotiation, agreed that the service animal designation covered this. Ghost didn't know about any of the rest of it. The men on the street, the phone calls, the network of quiet loyalty moving through channels that don't appear on organizational charts. He knew that his handler was in a bed with machines around him, and that the woman with the bandaged arm, who smelled like antiseptic and pine and something older, something that his instincts recognized as a specific category of human, had stood between him and harm. He knew what mattered. He had always known what mattered. At 7:15 that evening, Jess came back to the hospital. She hadn't planned to. She found herself in the parking lot without quite remembering the drive, which was how she knew it was the right decision. She went up to room 412. She knocked. "Come in," Marcus said. Ghost was on the floor, his chin on his paws, his eyes on the door. When Jess came in, his tail moved 3 times. Not more. He was a measured animal. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. Marcus looked at her for a moment. "You went outside," he said. "I did. Kraft called me after. Said you stayed for 2 hours. She had. She had stood on the stoop and shaken hands and said very little and listened to men tell her, briefly and without ornamentation, that they were glad she was all right, and then she had gone back upstairs and sat in her apartment while the trucks and SUVs gradually pulled away from the curb, one by one, until the street was ordinary again. "You didn't have to do any of this," Jess said. "No," Marcus agreed. "You didn't have to step in front of a knife for my dog." She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at Ghost instead. The old shepherd looked back at her with his amber eyes, and his scarred ear, and the unhurried patience of an animal who has decided something and doesn't need to announce it. He got up from the floor. walked the 3 steps to her chair, and lay down with his shoulder against her foot. He would be there when she left. He would be there when she came back, and she would come back because some things, once begun, have their own logic. Outside the window, the Cascade foothills had gone dark against a sky that was turning the deep blue of a late winter evening in eastern Washington. Somewhere in the city, Cody Breck was in a holding cell looking at charges that a duty attorney had already told him were not going away. Somewhere, Doyle Craft was making another call, because that was what Doyle Craft did. Somewhere, the neighbor's doorbell camera footage was being logged as evidence, and Detective Tanner was typing up a report with the meticulous care of someone who intends to make something stick. The hospital room was quiet. The monitors beeped their soft, steady rhythms. Marcus Webb closed his eyes and let himself rest for the first time. In days, his dog's warmth radiating from the floor, where Ghost lay at the feet of the woman who had kept him safe. Jess Morrow sat in the chair and did not move. Her arm ached under the bandage with a clean, honest pain, the kind that means something is healing. She thought, without planning to think it, that the smoke had cleared. Not the smoke from before, not entirely, not for good, but enough. A window opened, air moving through. That was enough.